The Jews over the years have suffered discrimination. They suffered discrimination in Spain. They suffered discrimination in Germany, and we remember the Holocaust. So that holding all factors constant, if there is a single nation on earth that should ensure that lives are protected, that the crime of genocide is not perpetrated against any peoples on the ground of their nationality or religion, it is the Israelis.
This is the journey to one Africa.
The Middle Eastern problem is one that has a long history. But in the context of modern history, we must go back to the Balfour Declaration in 1948 that led to the creation of the State of Israel as we know it today, and to what is normally called Nakba, which is the catastrophe that led to the expulsion en masse of the Palestinian population at that time. So if you want to understand what is happening in the Middle East, it must be understood in that context, and that is what has generated what we see today. So that the Palestinians have since 1948 considered themselves to be an aggrieved people. And the Israeli state, as we know it, has been on the defense, starting with the wars in 1948 and, of course, 1967 and 1973, and the two intifadas, the uprisings. So that you are talking about a Middle East that has been in conflict, pitting Arab countries and Israel. And that is what we see manifesting itself, culminating in the events of the 7th day of October, the year 2023, which has now given birth to what is the war in Gaza, and is one that is not going to be resolved as quickly as we want it to be resolved unless the fundamental and primary issues are dealt with. In other words, we must ask ourselves, what was the original sin that led to this conflict? The situation pitting the Israelis and the Palestinians is one that does not lend itself to simplistic answers. It is complex. It is complex, and we have seen it being dealt with in different ways over the years. Those who are objective agree that the best way to address the problem is through the two-state solution. And the two-state solution was a proposal that came out of the negotiation that took place in Oslo, Norway. It was thought at that time that the two parties, namely the Israelis and the Palestinians, would then sit down and agree to ensure that you would have an independent Israeli state which exists since 1948, and have a separate Palestinian state which would exist side by side with the Israeli state. But it has not been easy, because within the Israeli government, there are those who hold the view that the Palestinian state should not exist. And within Palestine, there are those who hold the view that Israel should not exist. So how do you reconcile these two extreme positions? And if you look to the history, people like Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the Fatah function of what was called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, of the PLO, over time accepted that you could not eliminate the state of Israel. But they are extremists whose clarion call is that we must eliminate Israel. And you see that not only within the states, like Iran, which says, kill the Americans, kill the Israelis, like Hamas, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, like the Houthis in Yemen. That is their clarion call. And in such a situation, Israel is always on the defensive. So going forward, one must then agree that in order to ensure that sustainable peace is achieved, the only thing that we must do as the rest of the world is to midwife a two-state solution. Easier said than done because of the extremists, but I believe that the solution lies in the middle. And the United Nations, in my view, has not played its role as it should have. The Arab League has not played its role as it should have. The Americans, to the extent that they cast their lot with the Israelis, have also in many ways stood in the path of this particular realization. And it is time now that the world must speak with one voice, demanding only one thing: two-state solution. Two-state solution. And that, in the nature of things, will calm down the temperatures and allow the two states to exist side by side in accordance with internationally accepted laws. You know, one of the things that we must say, and say categorically, is that what happened on the 7th day of October, the year 2023, is or was unacceptable. It was wrong for Hamas to do what they did. But it is incumbent upon a state, and Israel is a state that was one of the first signatories, if not the first signatory, of the Genocide Convention in 1948. And they did so because the Jews over the years have suffered discrimination. They suffered discrimination in Spain. They suffered discrimination in Germany, and we remember the Holocaust. So that holding all factors constant, if there is a single nation on earth that should ensure that lives are protected, that the crime of genocide is not perpetrated against any peoples on the ground of their nationality or religion, it is the Israelis. It therefore beggars belief and defeats reason when you listen to senior Israeli government officials, right from the president. President Herzog is on record, and is considered to be one of the more moderate Israelis, is on record as saying, we are dealing with human animals, and we are not going to spare any of them. There is no non-military target in Gaza. In other words, women who are non-combatants are targets. Children are targets. The fighters themselves are targets. Hospitals are targets. The Israeli defense minister gleefully said they will have no fuel, no water, no food. And one even went to the Bible in the book of Samuel and said, just like God ordered that the Amalekites be eliminated, so shall we eliminate the Palestinians in Gaza, that no human being may ever live in Gaza again. Against that background, the reference by the Republic of South Africa to the International Court of Justice is decent, it is understandable, it is acceptable. I've read and reread the 84-page document. It is one of the most well-prepared documentation presenting evidence of what constitutes the crime of genocide. And I believe that all men and women of goodwill throughout the world should support that reference, because that is what international community ought to do in a civilized way, in ways that are recognized and acceptable by the Committee of Nations. I cannot understand Kenya. I would understand Kenya if they condemned the act of Hamas on the 7th of October. But for them to say that we support the disproportionate response by the Israelis is one that defies logic. I don't know what is pushing my beloved Kenya to say that, but it is time that we revised our position. And unfortunately, I hold the view that in matters such as this, it would have been better if the African Union, as the African Union, held an emergency meeting of heads of states and governments so that we have a common position. Because this is critical. It is critical for our trade. It is critical for our relationship with very many countries in the world. And a common African position would have been preferred rather than to allow individual countries to be manipulated and sometimes even coerced to take the positions that they have taken, and which positions fly in the face of logic. That is one of the busiest maritime routes in the world. You will remember in the year 1956, when there was the Suez Canal crisis, the international trade was disrupted in a fundamental way. And we have seen recently during the war, when the Houthis in Yemen have said that they are not going to allow navigation in that area, particularly as regards seagoing vessels that are headed to Israel. And we have seen that it is not possible to get it right all the time, with the consequence that seagoing companies such as Maersk of Denmark have had to suspend almost 95% of their vessels from navigating through that route, which means that you are now taking a longer route. And if you are taking a longer route, it means that you increase the cost of insurance. It means the journey is longer. It means oil is going to become more expensive. And for those countries that are importing oil from that part of the world, it means, therefore, that the cost of living is going to be higher. And it is not something that we ought not to take very seriously, because the implications are dire and grave, and it will be evident in many countries in the continent of Africa, and indeed outside of the continent of Africa. And that is why, therefore, the UN has actually passed a resolution saying that the Yemeni Houthis should not interfere with maritime trade in that particular part of the world. But the Houthis, on their part, have said that we are, in fact, ensuring that international law is given its pride of place by the war and the continuous bombardment on Gaza being stopped. And we now know that it has brought into the conflict, to a certain extent, the Americans and the British, who have bombarded, as they say, it is very strategic precision bombing on the facilities on the ground, radar and other facilities in Yemen, and even in Sana'a, the capital. And the Houthis have said, we are going to respond. And our response is not going to be restricted to the region. It will be in whichever manner that we choose. This is not good. It is not good message. And it is something that could lead to anarchy and undermine trade and affect the economies of many countries in that region and outside of that region. You know, the United States of America has always considered itself the policeman of the world since the 1945. And in many ways, they have said, we are the defenders of the free world. And of course, they are the ones who define what the free world is. We are the defenders of democracy. We have the largest economy. We have the largest army. We, in our estimation, are the strongest militarily on earth. And we, therefore, are the ones who are going to protect the world. And you've seen that the United States of America has, on many occasions, defied the UN. They have on many occasions defied the Security Council. They did that, as you know, jointly with the United Kingdom in the case of Iraq. We know they have done that in quite a number of cases, and we know that they are going to continue to do that in order to protect their economy, in order to protect the dollar, and in order to remain, in their view, the hegemon in the world. Is it a good thing? No. It is not a good thing when you have unilateralism, when a single nation, without reference to established institutions, chooses to do things which could undermine international peace. But who can stop them? This is the question. Because many nations, even the strongest nation on earth, which are nuclear armed states, are reluctant to get into what would be an Armageddon. China is not prepared to do so. Russia is not prepared to do so. The Western world, of course, is always aligned and are the lapdogs of the United States of America. Iran, beyond the rhetoric, is not prepared to do so, because in the fullness of time, even if you think you can win a war, history has taught us that you can win the battle but never the war. The history of Afghanistan told us, the history of Vietnam told us, and the world and the people of the world have no appetite for conflict because it visits pain upon all. But the politicians and the military industry in the United States of America sometimes does not hearken to voices of reason. It does what it does with the consequences that are known to all of us, bad consequences. There are different views about what has happened in Yemen, because you remember that strike does then create an environment that potentially could widen the war. The Yemenis have now pronounced themselves, at least the Houthis who run Yemen in practical ways, have now pronounced themselves that the war is not only against the Israelis, but also against the United States of America and the UK. And remember, the clarion call of the Houthis is death to the Americans, death to the Jews. And remember, they also have allies in Hezbollah, which is based in Lebanon. Remember that they are also supported by the Tehran regime in Iran. So it is widening the war by bringing in other players who are not directly involved in the war. And that, to me, is not a good thing. And one therefore hopes that sooner rather than later, the diplomatic activities that we see in that region, and there have been quite a number of diplomatic activities. We have seen the Secretary of State from the United States of America doing a diplomatic round and visiting the countries, and his message, we don't want the war to escalate. We have seen the Chinese foreign minister is also visiting quite a number of states in that area. And the message that the world is trying to bring about is nobody wants to escalate the war. But you see, when you are dealing with Hamas, when you are dealing with the Houthis, when you are dealing with Hezbollah, you are not dealing with state actors. You are dealing with non-state actors, which do not feel bound by any international law. And they are not some of them are not regular armies. They could do anything, anywhere in the world. And this to me is what makes the whole situation very dangerous and makes the entire world a potential powder keg. They could blow up a civilian facility anywhere in the world. In other words, for them, every place in the world is a potential theater of war. And it is incumbent upon nations and politicians who lead nations to be sensitive to that reality for the sake of international trade and peace. You know, the Red Sea is a very important trade route, and this has been recognized over the years. When the Suez Canal was built, it was recognized that in order to make maritime trade become more efficient, you needed goods to pass through the Mediterranean, the Suez, and then into the Red Sea. In that way, you serve what we call the Eastern Indian Ocean and even go into the Atlantic and the Pacific. And that route does reduce costs in a very, very major way, because there are major ports there. You have Asaba, you have ports like Berbera, you have Djibouti, you have Hodeida, many critical ports in that area, and that also is a major oil-producing area. So you cannot, for any reason, underestimate the significance of the Red Sea as a major artery in international trade. And every country in that region must be very worried that in the event of a conflict, even the refugee situation will be exacerbated. We already know that during the Yemeni war, which involved the Saudis and the Yazidis who are the Houthis in Yemen, we already have a very dire refugee situation in Djibouti. And we already know that there is also some kind of discomfort that exists in Ethiopia between Somalia and the Ethiopians following the signing of this treaty with Somaliland regarding the port of Berbera and some coastline. So that region worries me, and indeed should worry everybody who is looking at the events on the Red Sea. And it is something that should be looked at very keenly, in my view, not only by the United Nations, it should be looked by the GCC countries, and I think the African Union should also focus on it, and the Arab League should also focus on it, Europe should also focus on it, and we are talking about countries in that region and countries that are involved in what is going around in that region that possess nuclear weapons. Israel said, one of the Israeli politicians said, that Gaza is a place where we should use a nuclear device. For the first time, confirming to the world what the world has already and has always known, that they have a nuclear device. Who knows whether Iran has a nuclear device? They possibly do. The British have a nuclear device. The Americans have a nuclear device. And it only takes a simple mistake to then ensure, and I'm using the word ensure deliberately, that the calm and quiet that obtains in the Red Sea is disturbed and disturbed for a long time. And this, I think, is why you see the flurry of diplomatic activity in order to de-escalate the conflict. But the rhetoric from Israel is not helping the situation. And as long as the Americans are urging them on and saying no ceasefire until we determine that we have completely degraded Hamas, we must remain worried. In matters such as these, to be neutral is to be dishonest. And we must condemn the acts of Hamas on the 7th day of October in the year 2023. But we must condemn also the Israelis for their disproportionate response But you've got to go to the root. What is the root? The root was that in 1948, the British, through the Balfour Agreement, allowed the expulsion of a whole nation, the Palestinians, in what is called the Nakba, the catastrophe. So that the Palestinians have been in a state of siege. They have been in a state of occupation in the manner that African countries were colonized. They have been in a state of apartheid in the manner that the South African blacks were held in apartheid by the white regime. And I cannot help but support the Palestinians as a nation and as a people. But I must condemn elements within the Palestinians who believe that violence will be the only way of solving this problem. So my personal sympathy is with the peoples of Palestine, and my wish is that we create an environment where the Palestinians will have a state of their own alongside Israel. And Israel, in my view, owing to its power that it enjoys today, is capable of facilitating the creation of a Palestinian state. Going back to Oslo and saying, let us have a Palestinian state on the basis of the 1967 boundaries. If that is done, we'll create a responsible state which is a full member rather than observer at the United Nations, which has international obligations, which, if it misbehaves, will then be dealt with like a member of the International Committee of Nations. But if you retain the current situation where there is no Palestinian state, then organizations such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and many others, which will mutate, will always threaten the peace of Israel. And what Israel deals with as peace will always be peace that means nothing. There'll be no peace that they desire and deserve. In my view, therefore, two-state solution is the answer to this problem. The times have been ending for a long time. I believe this Armageddon kind of thing which is pushed every other time. If you look at the history of the world, the end of the Roman Empire was said to be the end of times. Then we had the Millerite end of time in the year 1844. Then we thought that the First World War would be the war that ends all wars. Then we thought 1945 would be the war that ends all wars. Let us remember that as to how and when the war will end is not known to all of us. Our duty is to be responsible, to know that man has now created weapons which are capable of making life on earth to be very difficult. And it is our duty, therefore, to ensure that we never use those weapons against any nation, and that, therefore, we should aim to ensure that we use institutions that we have created over the years to prevent war. The very reason why we created the United Nations in 1945 after the collapse of the League of Nations was that the world had no appetite for war. But we have seen what has happened since the creation of the UN. And there are many now who are saying that you need to reform the UN. That the UN, as it is now, is incapable of enforcing the decision that it makes. We have seen how resolutions have been ignored without consequence. We have seen how wars are being prosecuted, the statements from all these multinational organizations notwithstanding. And perhaps when the wars that are being prosecuted now end or even before they end, it is the duty of the world to ask ourselves, what have we been doing wrong? What can we do, if not to eliminate war, to reduce war and conflict? Because the pain that it visits on human beings is intolerable.